One of the most important network components are DNS servers. And DNS requests and responses are the main reasons we are able to browse the internet as we do today. So they must be a big target for attacks, right? Well, not only that we are going to discuss DNS attacks, but we are also going to mention how DNS can be leveraged to hide an attack. But first of all, let's quickly recap what DNS really is. The domain name system, or DNS, is an essential component of the internet, translating human-readable domain names, like for example facebook.com, into IP addresses that computers use to identify each other on the network. Now, because DNS is foundational to how the internet works, it is also a frequent target for various attacks. These attacks can compromise the integrity and confidentiality of a network, leading to unauthorized access, data theft, or denial of service. The first thing that I want to talk about is DNS cache poisoning, also known as DNS spoofing. This is an attack where an attacker corrupts the DNS cache of a resolver by injecting malicious DNS responses. The goal is to trick the DNS resolver into caching and returning incorrect IP addresses for domain names, which ends up redirecting traffic to malicious servers. This attack can affect users by leading them to fraudulent websites, causing data theft, or launching further network-based attacks. So how does this attack really work? Well, let's have a step-by-step breakdown of DNS cache poisoning. First, there is a DNS query. A user or application initiates a DNS query asking the DNS resolver to resolve a domain name to an IP address. Then comes the DNS lookup. If the DNS resolver does not have the requested domain's IP address cached, it forwards the query to an authoritative DNS server or recursively looks for it. And here is where the attack begins. While the DNS resolver waits for the legitimate response from the authoritative DNS server, the attacker floods the DNS resolver with forged responses containing incorrect IP addresses. These forged responses are designed to trick the resolver into accepting the malicious data. Then, DNS queries and responses are identified using a transaction ID. The attacker tries to guess this ID, hoping to match the one in the legitimate DNS requests. If the attacker guesses correctly before the legitimate response arrives, the DNS resolver accepts the fake response. And then comes the cache injection. Once the resolver accepts the fake response, it caches the incorrect IP address for the domain name. This poisoned entry can persist in cache until its TTL, or time to live, expires, meaning that all future users querying the same domain will be directed to the attacker's server. Now, which files or components are actually targeted in DNS cache poisoning? Well, it specifically targets the DNS resolver's cache, where IP addresses of domain names are stored temporarily. The files themselves aren't typically targeted directly, but the in-memory DNS cache of the resolver is compromised. However, an attack which is on Unix or Linux, which defines which DNS servers the system uses for name resolution, and there is also hosts file, which is in /etc/hosts on Linux or in system32 drivers on Windows. Though it is unrelated to cache poisoning, manipulating the host file could allow attackers to override DNS for specific domains, right? Now, I mentioned at the start of the lecture that we will also be covering a technique that we could use to hide an attack with the help of DNS. That's right. And that technique that we will showcase is called DNS tunneling. DNS tunneling is a technique that allows data transfer between two systems through DNS queries. In this case, the DNS protocol, which is usually meant for domain name resolution, is exploited to covertly transmit data between a client and a server. This can be used for legitimate purposes, such as bypassing network restrictions, or for malicious purposes, such as exfiltrating sensitive data or establishing a backdoor into a network. So how exactly does it work? Well, first, the attacker sets up a domain and controls the authoritative DNS server for that domain. On the client side, for example, inside some restricted or monitored network, the attacker installs malware or uses a tool to encode data into DNS queries. The infected client then sends DNS queries containing the encoded data, which are small chunks of data or even command and control signals containing the encoded data to the attacker's domain. The attacker's DNS server receives the queries, decodes the data, and can respond with more encoded data or take actions based on the information provided. This could actually be used for reverse shell communication, which we will also showcase using DNS tunneling in this section. Now, we already mentioned why it is useful, but DNS tunneling can be useful, as I mentioned, for bypassing network restrictions, for data exfiltration, and for command and control. All of these things could benefit from using DNS tunneling. Alright, but more about DNS tunneling later. What are other things or other attacks that could target DNS? Well, we have domain hijacking. Domain hijacking occurs when an attacker gains unauthorized control over a domain name by exploiting vulnerabilities in the domain register or DNS settings. Once the domain is hijacked, the attacker can redirect traffic to malicious sites, compromise emails, or steal credentials. We also have DNS rebinding. DNS rebinding tricks a victim's browser into executing malicious scripts by changing the DNS resolution of a domain to the attacker's IP address. This enables the attacker to bypass same origin policy restrictions in web browser and interact with devices inside the victim's network. And you might have also heard about typo squatting. This attack exploits common user typing errors in domain names. For example, if you type google.com with 3 O's instead of google.com, you might end up on a phishing website. Attackers could register domains that resemble legitimate websites and use them to serve malware or phishing pages. Alright, so as with every other lecture, let us finish it off by discussing how can we protect ourselves from these attacks. Well, first of all, there is something called DNSSEC, which is Domain Name System Security Extensions. It adds a layer of authentication to DNS queries by ensuring that the DNS responses are signed with cryptographic keys. This helps prevent DNS spoofing and cache poisoning by verifying the legitimacy of DNS responses. You also want to use secure DNS resolvers, as configuring DNS servers to use reliable and secure resolvers can help protect against DNS spoofing and cache poisoning as well. Let's not forget the good old monitoring and logging. Monitoring DNS traffic for suspicious patterns such as unusually long or encoded DNS queries can help detect DNS tunneling attacks and spoofing attacks. Now, you also want to limit DNS cache TTL, and TTL stands once again for time to live. By setting a lower time to live on DNS cache entries, the impact of a successful cache poisoning attack can be minimized, as the poisoned records will expire sooner. And lastly, don't forget to use firewall rules and DNS filtering. Implementing firewall rules that restrict DNS queries and filtering out unauthorized DNS traffic can help prevent all DNS attacks, including spoofing, tunneling, and others.